Working Cows Podcast, episode 381. This episode is brought to you by C90 Ocean Minerals.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag Studios. And this episode is brought to you by C90 Ocean Minerals. C90 Ocean Minerals, the leading mineral and trace element sea salt for your herd, is now available nationwide at Tractor Supply Company. We're excited to bring the incredible benefits of our mineral-rich sea salt to more farmers and ranchers across the country. To find your closest Tractor Supply location, visit us at c-90.com/tractor today. Trouble with flies? Select stores also carry C90 mineral salt with garlic for fly control. Learn more today at c-90.com/tractor. I did also want to drop in here real quick and just give a shout out to the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition. They are hosting a fall grazing school in Anselmo, Nebraska, September 17th through the 19th with Jim Garish. He will be there being the instructor of this grazing school. It is hosted at the McGinn Ranch, which is Matt McGinn, been a guest on the Working Cows podcast before, and we talked about his ranch and the ways that they've made changes and improvements there. And so, again, you can attend the fall grazing school with Jim Garish as the instructor, hosted at the McGinn Ranch by the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition, September 17th through the 19th. Check out the show notes page for today, and there will be a link there as well. Show notes page for today is workingcows.net/381. Very excited to be joined today by Tom Krawiec once again. Glad to have him back on the podcast. Always an out-of-the-box thinker, and that's where we're at today, talking about something fairly outside the box, talking about the role that Native Americans, the Indigenous people on the North American continent, that they played in influencing the movement of bison throughout the history. And we hear a lot about the bison and how they were moved over the landscapes and how they were responsible for the deep-rooted perennial polycultures that were found here as the white settlers came west, and the soils that they found and the role that the bison played in forming those soils. And now we're going to talk to Tom about the role that the Native Americans played in that process, at least according to some new research and evidence and the interpretation of that evidence. So, Tom, thanks for joining me once again on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you, Cole. Clay? I should have called you Cole. Thank you, Clay.
I've been called worse, for sure. So,
yeah.
So you reached out a while back and said, you wanted to talk about kind of how the bison were influenced pre-colonization, what role mankind played in their movements. And of course, we've heard lots of talk about the bison and their role in creating healthy ecosystems. And I think wildlife in general, bison, antelope, deer, elk, you can call the role, right? But on some level, bison kind of being the major ones that seem to have been influencing this healthy ecosystem that we discovered here, with the Lewis and Clark and some of those, seeing what they saw as they traversed the American continent. And I guess it's very interesting to me. Of course, a lot of times in regenerative agriculture, we talk about mimicking the patterns of the bison, through high stock density and longer recovery periods or appropriate recovery periods and some of those things. So tell me what introduced you to this, to the way you think about these things, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, well, first of all, I need to correct you a little bit. I didn't reach out to talk about this. I reached out to correct you on something that you said in a podcast. And what it was that you said wolves were the predators that moved the bison
Mm.
around.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time in the mid 1700s, 1800s, that was not the case. It was the plains people who moved the bison around. You mentioned Lewis and Clark. Well, Meriwether Lewis took fantastic notes. And if anybody, has an inkling, it's a great read to read his journals. He's just, the notes that he took are fantastic. Um, anyways, he documented in his notes that, he observed the wolves. They followed the bison. They're in amongst the bison, but they did not harass the bison.
Mm.
They killed the sick and the maimed. They did not take down they did not go hunting like the wolves do now.
Mm.
Because there was just so many. There was no need for it.
Yeah,
So
no, I
they didn't do
appreciate
it.
the correction, and but I'm very interested because I'm actually preparing. By the time this comes out, I probably will have given a talk, or I for sure will have given a talk on kind of contrasting the different ways of looking at man's role on Earth,
Mm.
and I think that in my understanding, according to Scripture, God created man in His image, and He put us here to make things better. And I think that men or mankind, when they are managing appropriately, will make things better, not worse. And so I think it would make complete sense to me in the way I understand how things have come to exist, that the native populations, First Nations people, however we're gonna term that, they were having an influence on the bison, and were I think I understand you to be saying they were a net positive for the ecosystems that they were moving these bison through. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. I don't think they knew it. I think, and I'm not an expert. I've just, read these old journals and I kind of put things together, uh, and then coming from holistic management and all those, and ranching for profit, all those things that I know about that, kind of putting these things together, then my experience of grazing, it just seemed like they were exploitative in the sense that they did things so that it was easy for them. And we as graziers should take a lesson from that. They didn't work very hard. Well, maybe the women did, but honestly, they didn't work that hard. They burnt um, the prairies so that particularly early spring, so that the bison would come. So they didn't have to go hunting for bison. And from what I've read, they didn't actually follow the bison. The bison came to them. Well, there was just millions at that time. This idea of following the bison, that didn't happen until the end of
Mm.
as the bison were declining. Then of course you have to go and find them.
Mm.
But in mid 1700s, there was just millions. Well, early, maybe the first part of the 1800s as well. There was just so many bison that they didn't have to go hunting for them. Just to prove this just a little bit, just before I get into more of, I know what you're looking for, but all these other things. So I was reading this, the history of the uh, Wood Buffalo National Park, which is the largest national park, I think, in the world. Actually, it's in northern Alberta and a bit in Saskatchewan. So in 1920, uh, the park was developed, and then they stocked it with bison. Well, the Chippewa people were thrilled that the bison were back. However, they can't hunt in the national park.
Mm.
So guess what they did? In the spring, they just burnt on the outside of the park. Guess where the bison went?
Yeah.
They went looking for new grass, and it was outside the park. So there they are, free game.
Mm.
So there's that history of making things easy for ourselves. And the Plains people, I think, had it figured out pretty darn well.
Yeah. What are some of the resources that have kind of helped you shape your understanding of how all this played out?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that really started me going down this rabbit hole. One is there's a fellow, he's dead now, but Dr. Henry T. Lewis. So he was an anthropologist from the University of Alberta, and his PhD he wrote kind of into a little a short book. It's called A Time to Burn, which is really explains how prevalent um, it was for Indigenous people to burn. And the cool thing about that was my first year university, I just happened to be walking past, just walking down the hall, and I see this poster about this talk that he was giving. And I thought, sounds interesting. So I went in and listened to him. And then, 35 years later, I'm getting his PhD thesis, and I'm reading that, and I'm going down that rabbit hole of this burning. And then uh, the other paper that I read that really got me going down this rabbit hole was by Sierra D. Stoneberg Holt. And her paper is called Reinterpreting the 1882 Bison Population Collapse. And she really goes into a lot more details of, mainly American history from, I would say, from Lewis and Clark up until 1882. And I grew up thinking that it was the bison hunters who killed off all these bison. But really, the demise of the bison started in, from what I can glean, 1782. And in 1782, smallpox came, and it started the Gulf of Mexico and traveled north all the way up to Great Slave Lake. And the thing about smallpox, it wiped out 90% of the population. Can you imagine that, Clay?
Mm-hmm.
90% of the population gone in 6 months. There's a story, I have a lot of stories from the journals of David Thompson. And he talked about this one excerpt. He talked about this would be around St. Paul, Alberta, or current day St. Paul, Alberta, where there's just so many dead people that, and the 10% of people that were still alive, they were sick, and they couldn't, they were just struggling to survive. So they couldn't look after their dead relatives. So they're these dead people. And the wolves and the wild dogs came and consumed these dead bodies. And for 2 to 3 years after that, these wolves and wild dogs had no hair on their bellies. So that smallpox affected them as well. I haven't wrote this up yet, but I want to write this paper because I think, from what I can glean, overgrazing started in 1782. Because prior to that, the people burnt, and they moved the bison. First they brought the bison after winter to them, and then when the bison would come, they would go and harvest, maybe 200 bison at a time. But in that melee, they would move the bison along, and then to the next village. Then the next village would do the same thing, and it just kind of kept having these bison moving along the plains. They couldn't park. They're still quite tame, but they couldn't park. They were moved along. So then, where do we go from here? So they were moved along, and so in 1782, here's this little story that really struck me about the overgrazing. In David Thompson's journal, he told a story that was related to him by a fellow who was part of a a raiding party that went down to it was a retribution raid against the Snake Indians, the Snake tribe, who were in kind of central Montana. So, and this group went from what is now southern Alberta. So they go down and they're on this hill and they're watching this village. There's about 1,200 to 1,500 people in that village, and that'd be about 250 teepees or so, and nothing is happening. There's no movement, and what really piqued my interest was he made the comment about the bison are just right beside the village, grazing for 3 days. They're just there, and nobody's harassing them, out hunting them. So on the fourth day, they go down and they attack the village. Everybody's dead or dying. So they cut a trail back to Alberta. And by the time they got back to their village, they're already getting sick. But like I said, the overgrazing, that little tidbit in that story started me thinking about this, how early the overgrazing started. And then you get to, Lewis and Clark's time. And again, Meriwether Lewis took fantastic notes in his journal. He documented the unhealthy vegetation, the dry stream beds. Like as you're going up the Missouri, there's all these tributaries, they're bone dry. And the banks are falling in, totally eroded. And the grass is grazed to the ground. There's still the huge herds of bison, elk, deer, and lots of goats as well. But
the connection then is smallpox epidemic wipes out 90% of the population. Now the population is too small to manage this bison population. Is that what you're saying? They're no longer influencing this bison population. So by the time Lewis and Clark go on their expedition, 1804 to 1806, we're talking 20 some years, 22 years there, that they're starting to see the impacts of this reduced indigenous population and the fact that the bison are now able to camp out and overgraze these areas, leading to dry stream beds and collapsing banks. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you say?
Exactly correct. Yeah. So that happened in the space of 20 years. Okay. And prior to that, there was, again, going back to David Thompson, he told a story of a trader that worked for the Northwest Trading Company. And normally on these trading, he went on a trading tour of the Western Canada right now. So he did that in 1775. Okay. And there were just so many bison that the next time that he did this, went on this sojourn, this trading route, or trading trip, I should say. So that would have been, he went there in 1788. The next one, he hardly took any provisions. And they almost starved because the only bison that were left at that time were they'd find a lone bull. And that's the only bison that they found in 2 years, that whole trip. So that tells me that when you put that together with what happened in 1782, so 90% of the population is gone, not moving those bison around. And then you have this fellow, comes through in 1788, and there's no bison in the northern plains. All those bison are south. So basically, a third of the plains has been taken out of use because the bison, they don't come up to where it's cold. where there's snow, they just stay south because there's nothing pushing them around.
Mm.
So can you imagine how much forage there was, that there had to be on the plains to be able to take 30% out and still handle those the same number of bison.
Mm.
However, when Lewis and Clark got there 20 years later, different story. They were seeing, severe grazing.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't seeing the huge, lush pastures that, that had to have been there 20 years earlier. If for the bison to be able to survive 365 days a year with no supplementation.
Sure.
You take my point there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so then what happened? Dr. Holt, again, her paper, Reinterpreting the 1882 Bison Population Collapse, she goes into real detail about all the sickness that happened. And just to give you an example of what happened, first of all, they probably starved to death, come winter. And Dr. Holt talks about that in her journal, where these bison just lay down and went to sleep.
Mm.
And I found a little tidbit. A guy named Yellowstone Kelly wrote in his journal. So this is from 1867. So before the big hunt, because there was 3 years. I think it was, I want to say 1874, 75, and 76. There's 3 years where it was a huge hunt, and they took, initially I saw about 375,000 bison each year. But even if you estimate that up, right, it still doesn't account for how many dead bison there were in that period of time.
Right.
But I'll just give you an example, like from this Yellowstone Kelly. So, and again, this is from 1867. On all sides, as far as the eye could reach, was dotted with bodies of dead buffaloes. These animals were in good condition and bore no mark of bullet or arrow wounds. The cause of their death was a mystery to us. So many carcasses scattered around made a strong impression on my mind. So that happened again before those 3 years of what we were taught in school as the massacre of the bison. Basically, the bison ate themselves out of house and home, and then they were susceptible to all these diseases.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, C90 Ocean Minerals. C90 Ocean Minerals, the leading mineral and trace element sea salt for your herd, is now available nationwide at Tractor Supply Company. We're excited to bring the incredible benefits of our mineral-rich sea salt to more farmers and ranchers across the country. To find your closest Tractor Supply location, visit us at c-90.com/tractor today. Trouble with flies? Select stores also carry C90 mineral salt with garlic for fly control. Learn more today at c-90.com/tractor. As I understand it, or actually was recently brought to my attention, I should probably say, the Bison massacre of 1870, whatever you said, 74 to 76, I think, was more like a warfare tactic, right? I mean, we were trying to deplete the food supply of the indigenous people so that we could, be able to conquer that land. Does that kind of match with your understanding?
You bet.
But as you said, I think even if we estimate up to 500,000 a year, that's 1.5 million in 3 years. We were talking bison herds of 30 plus million, right? Or even higher, probably back before the population collapse. Is that also correct, or is it even higher than that?
Well, there's estimation 40 to 60 million.
Yeah. I've always kind of heard that the bison herd was in the neighborhood of the American cow herd, or right around there. What we have now for cows is basically what we had for bison back in the day. And
interesting.
So I don't know if anybody else has made that connection or if it's intentional or I'm making that up, but I think that's I think that's pretty accurate. I didn't have my voicemail turned off, so just a second.
You got to remember also, on top of all those bison, there were millions of elk.
Right.
Okay, and antelope that were on top of that. But from all the journals that I've read, the Plains people didn't eat elk. They didn't eat elk and they didn't eat fish. Bison is all they ate.
Smart.
Basically, yes, they had, I get these tidbits because, of course, all these journals are written by white European men, so they have that bias. And but the women, so that you don't get to see, or, I didn't get to read about the women's side of the, life. But there was some excerpts of, they had, there was a type of nuts that Meriwether Lewis talked about. The women, they would find that there's a type of rodent, and they stored this type of nut in the ground, and all they had to do is watch where these rodents were, and there they had their had their nuts. They didn't have to go pick them. So,
yeah.
But anyways, like one thing, when again, when Lewis and Clark came through, say already the degradation of the plains was happening. So once you got to that level, well, then anthrax, can infect the animals because it's in the ground. And so when you have all these areas that are degraded, more likelihood of anthrax. And then one of the kind of big thing is that Texas tick coming from the free grazers. Do you remember? Did you ever watch Lonesome Dove?
Mm-hmm.
Well, those guys were free grazers,
mm-hmm.
and those are the guys that come up, and with their cattle from Texas, and their cattle already were immune to the Texas tick. But that Texas tick has a mortality rate of 80%. So as they come north, and then the population is already their health is depressed, and here's another nail in the coffin is the Texas tick. And I guess the last herd that Dr. Holt talks about is the northern herd, and how, and she documents it too. 1882 was the northern herd, and that was kind of the collapse of there. And I forget how many million she had estimated were in the northern herd. It's kind of like 3 or 4 million were left in the northern herd.
Sure.
I found it fascinating. There's a guy named Anthony Hendy, and up here in our area, he kind of looked at now as an explorer. In fact, there's a ring road in Edmonton that's named after him, and that's what I thought. I thought he was an explorer, and then I was able to track down his journal. He was a 24-year-old kid. His boss, there was a group of people that had come from the West, and they were heading back. And he said, why don't you go with these, jump in with these guys and write down what you see. 24-year-old kid, and he's a tourist. He went with these guys, and he took such terrible notes. If I was his boss, I would have been. Because I'll give you an example. Here's what his notes were. Killed 45 bison, or July, okay, just as an example. July 12th, killed 45 bison, 12 moose. That was his entry for the whole day. And his whole journal was like that. And he was on that trip for a year and a half. And the whole book, all his journals were just, sure, there may be a few little tidbits, but not much.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about So his was, I think that was 1745, if I remember correctly. But the cool thing about that was they didn't have muskets at that time. It was bow, arrow, and spear.
Mm-hmm.
And they're walking along. They didn't have horses at the time. They're walking along, and they're killing this many animals as they're moving, and they're doing this every day. Clay,
Mm-hmm.
can you? I just when I'm out there, I try and picture what it was like, and I also try and picture what it was like not having trees.
Mm.
It's hard for me. I'll give you this tree thing is interrelated too. It's the Plains people had it figured out.
Mm.
They had it figured out just to make life easy for themselves. And what it did for the soil, that's a byproduct.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think from
Right.
what
Yep.
of course I don't know, but I know that it was a byproduct of what they were doing, so that when in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, when the settlers came from Europe, late 1800s, there was 6 feet of topsoil.
Yeah.
There sure isn't 6 feet of topsoil now, man. But somehow that was created. And I think that was a byproduct of how the Plains people burnt. And, and then they moved the bison along.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of something that I know just because I've been there. So there was, I read this book. It was the first 30 years of the Northwest Mounted Police.
Mm.
And so there's a report. A constable had a prisoner he was taking from Fort Chipewyan to Fort Saskatchewan. So that's he wrote his report in 1904, and it was so that it would be the winter of 1904. He's with dog sled. It's freezing cold, and he sets out from Fort Chipewyan, which is in northern Alberta, and with his dog sled, and there are no trees until he hits Fort Mackay. Now, Fort Mackay is along the Athabasca River. So he gets to Fort Mackay. There's trees. He goes along the river, trees, gets to Fort McMurray. There's trees. Gets south of Fort McMurray, leaves the river, and it's all grassland, all prairie, all the way to Fort Saskatchewan. Now, that route that he took, there's a highway there. I've driven that highway numerous times. It is all trees, all the way from Lac La Biche, all the way to Fort Chipewyan. It's all trees, man.
Well, and there's a soil type, right, in northern Alberta, maybe other parts of Canada, but I'm familiar with northern Alberta from just spending a week there one time a few years ago. There's a soil type there called the gray wooded soil, right? I mean, it's a place that's prone to growing trees if it's allowed to. And what I think I hear you saying is that the Indigenous people were influencing that away from growing trees.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And the funny thing is just the way we are as people. So Dr. Lewis, the author of the Time to Burn.
Yep.
Okay. So he talked about so in 1954 there was an anthropologist who wrote a paper stating just what you just said, that these Indigenous people influenced their environment a lot. And he got blackballed until the mid-70s, till other anthropologists started looking at things a little different, and they did influence things a lot. Clay, from what I can glean from the journals of David Thompson, and then there's another guy, Alexander Mackenzie. He worked for the Northwest Trading Company, and he did a lot of exploring / trading. He was looking for a trading route, but from Fort Chipewyan and then out to the west. He went up the Peace River. And then there's another bit. There's a guy called Samuel Hearn, and he worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. He was out on kind of where Churchill is now on the Hudson's Bay. He was the factor of that post, but he had to go and find the Arctic Ocean. So he was out west, but very north. And then, so he would have been on the north, coming on the north side of the Great Slave Lake. But all those journals, they all come together and tell me the same thing. The Great Plains extended all the way to Great Slave Lake and all the way to the mountains. And I never, that just turned things on my head from what I thought I knew, what I was taught in school. And it was all because they were burning.
Yeah.
Alexander Mackenzie talked about, well, they were starving when they were coming back from the coast and coming across the mountains, because there was no game in the mountains at that time. It was all out on the grasslands, because that's where the forage was. So they were coming across the mountains, and that would have been where Fort St. John is now. So quite a bit north in northern BC. And he was writing in his journals, he couldn't wait to get back across the mountains to the herds of bison.
Wow. So they weren't west of the mountains.
The bison?
Yeah.
No.
No. Interesting. So yeah, there's a few things we've touched on here. I mentioned briefly that I had been in Alberta. I went to Camrose up there near Edmonton, Alberta, for the Holistic Management Canada Conference in January of 2020. And it was a partnered conference with Organic Alberta. And so the first couple of days were about organic farming, and then the last day was about holistic management. And one of the guys got up there, Indigenous guy got up there during the Organic Alberta portion of the conference, and he said, I'm a 40th generation farmer, those, everybody always gets up there and says, I'm third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation. If you're really, really cool, you might say you're sixth generation, but he gets up there, I'm a 40th generation farmer. So just that perspective and thinking about how long those people have been here, and probably all of the wisdom that was passed down through the generations of how do we manage this landscape? How do we make sure that there's food to eat? How do we survive out here without any, there was no supply chain for them. They were their own supply chain. They manufactured all their own housing, clothing, and tools, weapons, and produced or acquired all of their own food. And it was, like you said, groups of maybe 1,500 people living in a community doing this work. So just to think about the kind of wisdom it would take to survive that many generations under those circumstances, and continue to do it. That's a pretty incredible thing to think about. When the most I've ever heard anybody say on the Working Cows podcast was 10 generations. They can track back to the 1780s, I think, of people that in their family that have been ranching or farming in that area, and that was in North Carolina. So of course, some of the first original colonies, right? So, but to think, there's thousands of years of history of indigenous peoples here before that, and just the way that what they had to be able to do to survive with, like I said, no supply chain. They were their own supply chain, and we're 48 hours from everything falling apart here in our Western culture, right? I mean, we saw it in COVID. We got a preview of it in COVID, but I owned a coffee shop for 10 years, and they got a milk truck twice a week, so at most you're 72 hours from not having any milk on the shelves, and so it's just a totally different way of thinking and living.
It was too bad that Dr. Lewis wasn't able to put all his research into his thesis. Because, like I said, in 1984, I went and listened to him, and lots of those things that he talked about that the people did were not in his thesis. An example was how the women, well, farmed basically, and they burnt to keep their berries open and to keep their berries healthy. And the men up. This is from the Slavey people in Northwest Territories. They burnt to keep the game trails open. I just find it fascinating how they affected the environment. And what the hell are we doing? All these wildfires. It's just automatic. Everybody. Climate change. And yep. I'm not denying that, yes, our climate is changing. I'm not denying that, but we need to look a little different, a little more, a little deeper. I'll give you, so in Jasper right now. So have you heard about Jasper? 30% of the town. Yeah.
Yep.
30% of the town.
Yeah.
It's gone.
I hadn't heard that. Wow.
Yeah. 30% of the town. It's, I remember driving through Slave Lake when Slave Lake was burnt, and it's just like, holy crap. You're driving down these streets, and there's just holes in the ground.
Oh, wow.
Of a basement, and then, but over in Jasper, there's a fantastic, beautiful place called Moline Canyon and Moline Lake. And up at Moline Lake, they have a nice lodge. And out to the southwest of the lodge, there's a mountain called Bald Mountain. While I was looking over there, well, why is it called Bald Mountain? It's full of pine trees. And then I'm looking at these pictures of when that lodge was built, and there's a picture of Bald Mountain.
Yeah.
There are no trees on that mountain.
Right.
A friend of mine at Natton, Bill Shields, he was telling me about there's a lake up on a mountain where he lives, and a neighbor lady of his, the elderly woman, she was telling him how when she was a little kid, they used to ride their horses up there to go swimming and fishing. And now you can barely, it'd be a hassle to walk up there because all the deadfall. And we miss that. And we miss that. One time the Plains people, the Indigenous people kept those open. Dr. Lewis talks about how, in the mountainous regions, those people burnt, and they kept the understory open. There's, more grass, more game is able to be in there. And sometimes the conditions, they'd burn up the mountain, and sometimes they'd burn down the mountain. And it depends on what the conditions were like.
Yeah.
And, he talks about, he talked about the Plains people burnt every spring. Every spring they burnt. But they never burnt in the summer. And only occasionally did they burn in the fall. The conditions had to be just right in the fall.
Yep. Yeah. That's basically my thesis for this talk that I'm giving on August 13th is that, what it seems to be that the only other option for most people is preservation. We've got to kick out all the people. Don't let the people touch it because what's right is what's natural, and what's natural is the absence of mankind. Well, I would make an argument that that's not the case, that that mankind was put here for the purpose of influencing these landscapes, and that mankind has always influenced these landscapes. And when there is mankind present, there's better. Those places are better than when they're not. And I think that those places that were open, Bald Mountain, game trails that were open, understory in the forest that was able to grow grass. That's because mankind was there, exerting influence, making decisions. And I would say that my guess would be they weren't burning the same place every spring. They were burning a different place this spring than they did last spring, and giving those and getting that fresh growth in there to attract bison to that place.
I think kind of what I can glean is that they burnt where they needed to.
Right.
Dr. Lewis also did research in Australia, and these wildfires in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
The Indigenous people, before they were banned from burning, so you have your wet season, you have dry season. Okay, so your wet season, so now the dry season is coming. They started burning. As soon as they could, they started burning. So you have these circles of dry areas, and it just kept going along. And so then when you always had this green grass, some green grass growing. Okay. Of course, some of it's going to be, brown and old and brown, but there was some green grass. Green grass doesn't burn. So they were doing this so that they did not have these huge wildfires.
Sure.
But then when they got, they were banned from burning, then that changes things. Right. It happened in Canada too. The 1911, the government put a moratorium on, not a moratorium, they banned burning. And so then you had all these rogue pyromaniacs, kind of like that Brian Alexander from Ranching Reboot. Have you ever talked to him?
Oh, yeah.
He loves burning.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, of course. But, you have all these rogue burnings. They're trying to keep up their traditions, and they know that it was good for the environment and
right.
for safety. I'll give you, and it's not that long, Clay. So so I had this old friend. I had a lot of elderly friends, and this one guy, Dave Martin. So he was showing me this picture of his first house, and it was from 1952. And I said, "Where's that, Dave?" He said, "Well, Tom, you know where that is." I said, "Yeah, I know, but it can't be because there's no trees." And he said, "Oh yeah, back then there were trees." I said, "What are you talking about?" "Yeah, we burnt all the time. There's no trees." And so then I was telling another neighbor about this, and he said, "That's," and so he called his mom, and his mom moved to the area in 1952. And she said, "Oh yeah, Kelly, there were no trees. You could see all the way to Forfar." And I think our memory is only about barely one generation.
Mm-hmm.
We forget,
mm-hmm.
And then, so after this incident with Dave Martin, I was talking to another elderly friend, Gord Sawchuk. And so he would have been, in the 30s. I think he would have been, 6 or 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So actually where I live in Athabasca, to the 2 miles to the north, there's all this bush, and it was that used to be all grassland. And Gord was telling me, so when he was 6 or 7, all these immigrants, they had 10 to 15 cows, and in the spring they would put the cows out in that grassland there, and it ran for about 12 miles all the way to the river. Okay. And it was Gord's job every 2 or 3 days to go out and gather their cows and make sure that they were staying together. And this happened with, all these immigrant families. And then August, September, they would come and they would hay that because it was free. And the surprising thing was that hay was pretty darn good because the cattle were out there clipping it all summer long. So they were getting probably third cut hay.
Yep.
So can you imagine what kind of quality that was?
Right. Yeah.
However, something happened, and that got burnt, and and then with different regulations, they stopped doing that. And today, that's 12 miles. It's all bush, the whole 12 miles, all the way to the river.
Yeah, for sure. So, we've talked a lot about, different people and their understanding of these things and their research and the journals that they wrote, and our ability to go back and kind of understand what they were seeing as a result of writing those journals. And what we've talked mostly about is the Plains people and their use of fire for managing these grasses and the trees and all those things, and attracting the bison to come and graze those areas in the late spring and summer. What were some of, as you understand it, according to your research, what were some of the other tools that they used, or what were some of the other ways that they exerted influence, or was it pretty much just fire?
Well, the hunt. Okay, they used the fire to to control the brush, because up here in this area, it's like brush will grow like, I remember having to clear out poplars, that were about 10 feet tall, with cattle. And that would have been, they grew, we did some logging, and they grew back, I'd say in 4 years, they were 10 feet tall. That's how fast the brush goes back. So they were using fire to do that. But the big thing for the soil was the hunt. They were just living their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I take it. They were living their lives. And, so they planned their hunts, and then, the animals had to move along, stampede a little bit and move along. And then, it's the next group, they move them along.
Yeah.
That's the only tools that I can, again, I'm not an expert. I'm not an anthropologist. I've read maybe 10 journals.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my limited knowledge.
Well, no, I appreciate it. Appreciate you, like I said, reaching out, offering the correction, and helping us shape our understanding a little bit better here today. I'm going to work hard on this show notes page to include as much of what we talked about as far as resources as I can, and I'll send you a copy of that before I release it to make sure that I've got the right version of the journals, if I can find them, linked there, and some of that. So anything else that you wanted to say on this topic, or things that really you think we shouldn't leave without mentioning?
There's lots more on this topic. But I think really the takeaway is everything that we think we know may not be right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I can't tell you how many things have been turned upside down for me, and I've had a hard time accepting, because it's so ingrained. Just like this idea of all these trees, or sorry, lack of trees,
right?
And I just thought, particularly where I come from, it's oil field and world and logging, and we're taking so many trees. There's more trees now. Probably, I'd hazard a guess, definitely in my area, probably 3 times more trees than there were in the mid 1700s.
Yeah. Yeah, incredible. And I think it goes to something that I've really been noticing in every area. It seems like, and you mentioned it, that we have about a generation's worth of memory. And the way I talk about that is I say this is the eternality of the present. We think that the way it is now is the way it's always been. And my favorite illustration of that is that really we didn't feed corn to cattle in this country until after World War II. And everybody thinks, well, we've been feeding corn to cattle forever. No, absolutely not.
It was documented. I read a book, The History of the Matador Ranches. And so they had 8 Scottish guys that started a ranch in the Panhandle in Texas. And they hired a Scottish banker from Oregon. And so lots of stuff from his journals. Yeah, and they had to do something because after the Second World War, all these veterans come, they were eating uh, beef that was grain fed, so much milder flavor, and they come back and very strong grass fed. They're not used to that anymore, so they have to do something. And here comes the corn.
Yeah,
according to him, anyways.
Yeah, and I've heard various other versions of that story that that we were producing way more corn than we had before because all of that industrialization for the war effort got turned on to agriculture, and we started using all these bigger tractors, growing more corn than we had, and it became so worthless that they were just burning massive piles of corn. And they're like, well, if we're going to burn it, we might as well feed it to something. So they started feeding it to cattle. So I mean, there's probably in different areas that happen different ways, but
sure.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure.
Yeah. Hey, Clay, I just want to put maybe a correction on something that you were, or add on to something that you were saying about people. We need people to affect the environment to keep it healthy. And I think that's, we need people with intention. Okay. So, because here's something that I hear about a lot of ranchers, they drum that drum and they say, oh, well, we're helping the environment. Well, I've seen the range in the Chilcotin area. It's disgusting. And I don't care. I may get hate mail about this, but I've been there and I just like, what the hell is going on here? And this is from, I've seen range from managers that are, touting this holistic drum, and they have abused that range is abused. And I'm sure that there's lots in the US, there's lots all over that is abused because the cattle get put up there and they aren't getting moved around like the plains people moved them around. The animals aren't herded up. They're not trained to herd. I don't know if you're familiar with Bob Kinford. I forget exactly what his term is, but it's I call it creating the mob. You have to train your animals to act as a mob, and then you have to move them around with intention. And when you kick them out on a big range with no intention, you are damaging the range just as much as if they weren't there.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's my little add-on.
No, I 100% agree with that. I think that we're supposed to be good stewards of what we've been entrusted with, and I think knowingly or unknowingly, different people throughout history have discovered that this landscape responds best when it's managed this way, and this way tends to look a lot like holistic management now, with appropriate recovery periods, high stock densities, all of these other things that take intention. This doesn't happen by accident. You've got to have a positive influence. So absolutely, mankind can positively influence things and mankind can negatively influence things. And so we want to obviously go the positive route and make things better, leave them better than when we found them, for sure. Yeah. Wholeheartedly agree. So how's the book? Any feedback or things like that on the book that you've have been?
You know what? I've just been chugging along. Sales are good, or decent. My publisher thinks they're great, but I have to tell you, I was getting all geared up to really with social media to push my book. And after this spring, spending the 6 weeks out at my buddy's place, I told you before we started recording, he broke his ribs just at the start of calving, and I went to help him out, and it was not fun because he's things weren't simple, but it was so much fun for me to just go and do stuff and get things simplified. And I forgot how much, I realized how much I miss ranching, and that's where my heart is. So I'm not bothering promoting my book anymore. I'm focusing on finding some land, I haven't been able to procure a actual ranch. So I just realized I can start where I started, 24 years ago. I started with 373 acres. So I'm just going to start there, because in 5 to 7 years, I had 5,500 acres and 3,000 head, custom grazing. I can do it again. And now there's a lot more that I know, and I won't, I shouldn't make all the mistakes that I made before, hopefully. So that's where my focus is. And so next spring I'll be back ranching, and I'm pretty excited about it. But of course, you can still buy my book. You probably haven't read the whole thing yet, haven't you?
Oh yeah, I've read it all. Yep.
Oh yeah. Oh good.
Yep.
Good.
Read it all. Read some chapters multiple times. So
Cool.
for sure.
Cool.
So
anyway,
yes.
so that's the book is called Ranching Like a 12-Year-Old, and still buy it. Just Google it, and it'll come up. And yeah.
Yep. And there will be a link to it in the show notes page, simplyranching.ca, and you can find it at the show notes page for today. So we'll have links there. And Tom, thank you for reaching out and still responding to my email 6 months later. I appreciate that.
Cool.
Very good stuff there with Tom. Really appreciate him taking the time to join me and share some of that paradigm challenging content. So really enjoyed that conversation. Coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we'll be talking to Roy Thompson. Roy Thompson will be speaking at a Pennington County Conservation meeting on September 25th. And the Pennington County Conservation District has bringing him in. That's in around Rapid City, South Dakota, is where Pennington County is. So he's coming in, and he's going to talk about how human health begins in the soil and his personal journey from dis-ease to the abundant life and his journey into regenerative agriculture. So we'll be talking with Roy Thompson about that, coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.